Greetings. I hope you are well. Welcome to the first of my Christmas whispers. And to celebrate the 1st of December, I thought I would return to my roots and tell you a good old-fashioned bedtime story. Now, as you can see, or as you can hear, should I say, the fire is burning. Can you hear those logs cracking? And those coals burning away and feeling that heat radiating over your skin. So I really just ask you to lie back and feel that warmth and that contentment. And let me tell you a story and just forget about the world and live in this beautiful scenario. Okay, now the story that I've selected is a story which is not exactly known as a Christmas story as such, but it is a story with a fantastic, exquisite Christmas feel to it. And it is, without further ado, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Now, the very special version about this one is that it has been adapted so that it can be read in one sitting rather than chapters as such. And the extra special thing is that it has been illustrated by Christian Birmingham, who is a renowned artist who uses chalks and oil pastels, I think. And as you can see, some of the illustrations that he has done in this is absolutely wonderful and really brings the story alive in a big way. How could you not fall in love with those scenes of Narnia in the snow? Now, that just transports you straight into Narnia. And I'd like to read it for you, if you may. And of course, this book just feels fantastic. I like a nice big book, and great to do some tapping. So, I hope you are comfortable and relaxed, and just lie in there and let me tell you the wonderful story of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Enjoy.
Once there were 4 children named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. They were sent away from London during the Second World War to the house of a kind old professor who lived in the country. On the first morning, the children decided to explore the big house. It was full of interesting things and unexpected places. One room had a suit of armour in it. Another, all hung with green, had a harp in the corner. One room was quite empty except for a big wardrobe with a looking glass in the door. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. Opening the wardrobe door, she saw several long fur coats hanging up, and immediately got in amongst them. As she went further in, she noticed to her surprise that the soft furs began to feel rough and prickly, just like the branches of trees. A moment later, Lucy was standing in the middle of a wood, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but very excited too. Ahead of her, between the dark tree trunks, was shining. As she walked toward it, crunch, crunch went the snow. It was a lamppost. As Lucy stood wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, she heard the pitter-patter of feet, and then a very strange person stepped out amongst the trees. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like goats. He had a pleasant little face and curly hair, out of which stuck 2 horns. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave a start of surprise. "Good evening," said Lucy. "Good evening," said the fawn. "Excuse me, but are you a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. "But forgive me, are you what they call a girl?" he asked. "Of course I am," said Lucy, thinking his questions were very strange. "I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before," said the fawn. "I'm delighted to meet you. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "May I ask, O daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how have you come to Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn. "Everything that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea." "I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus, "if only I'd worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I would know all about these strange countries." "But these aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there. It's summer there." "Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it's winter here in Narnia, and it has been for ever so long. We shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve from the far land of Spare would you like to come and have tea with me?" "I'd like that very much," said Lucy, who was feeling quite hungry, "but I won't be able to stay long." And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood, arm in arm with the fawn, as if they'd known each other for all of their lives. They had not gone far when Mr. Tumnus led Lucy into a little cave where a wood fire burned merrily. Lucy thought she'd never seen a nicer place. For tea there was a nice brown egg each, sardines on toast, honey with toast, and finally a sugar-topped cake. The fawn told Lucy wonderful stories of life in Narnia, about midnight dances with wood nymphs and water sprites, about the milky white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him, and treasure seeking with the red dwarfs. Then he took up a little flute and played a tune that made Lucy want to cry, laugh and dance all at the same time. Finally she said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm sorry to stop you, but I really must go home." To her surprise, the fawn's brown eyes filled with tears. "Oh, I'm such a bad fawn," he sobbed. Lucy put her arms around him and gave him her handkerchief. "No, you're not," she said. "You're the nicest fawn I've ever met. But what have you done?" "I'm in pay of the White Witch," Mr. Tumnus wept. "It is she that has Narnia under her thumb and makes it always winter and never Christmas. Think of that." "How awful," said Lucy. But what does she pay you for? That's the worst of it, said Mr. Tumnus with a groan. I had orders from her that if I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. Oh, but you won't tell, will you, Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy anxiously. If I don't, he replied, she'll wave her wand and turn me into stone, so that I will be a statue in a horrible house. I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please let me go home. Of course I will, said Mr. Tumnus the fawn. I can't give you up to the witch, but now that I know you, we must be off at once. This whole wood is full of her spies. So they hurried through the darkness, back to the lamppost. Go home as quickly as you can, said the fawn, and can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Why, of course I can, said Lucy. I do hope you don't get into trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus. Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief? Of course. Goodbye, said Lucy, running through the wardrobe door. Soon, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt soft furs and coats. And all at once, she was stepping out into the empty spare room. Lucy ran in the hall where Peter, Susan and Edmund were still standing. I'm here, she shouted. I come back. I'm all right. What are you talking about, Lucy? Said Susan. For them, no time had passed at all. Lucy told them excitedly that the wardrobe was a magic one. There's a wood inside of it, and it's snowing, and there's a fawn and a witch. It's called Narnia. Come and see. The others didn't know what to think and followed her back into the room. But when Susan pulled the fur coats apart, all they saw was the back of a wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter rapped his knuckles on it to make sure it was solid. Poor Lucy couldn't understand it at all, and the others simply thought she was making it up. The next wet day, the children decided to play hide and seek. Lucy went at once to the wardrobe. She wanted to have one more look inside it, for she was beginning to wonder whether Narnia hadn't been a dream. Meanwhile, Edmund, who could be quite spiteful, secretly followed Lucy to tease her about her imaginary country. He came into the spare room just in time to see her vanishing into the wardrobe. Jumping in after her, Edmund closed the door behind him. Forgetting what a silly thing this is to do. To his astonishment, he found himself in the middle of a snowy wood. Lucy was nowhere to be seen, and everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature around. When Edmund heard the sound of bells, it came nearer and nearer. Moments later, a sledge swept into sight, driven by a fat dwarf, and behind him stood a great lady covered in a white fur coat up to her throat. She held a long, straight golden wand in her hand and wore a golden crown. Her face was as white as snow, beautiful and proud. Stop, ordered the lady. And what, pray are you? She asked, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund, he replied. The lady frowned. Is that how you dress a queen? She asked sternly. I repeat, what are you? An overgrown dwarf? No, I'm a boy, your majesty, said Edmund. A son of Adam, hissed the queen and raised her wand. Just as Edmund thought she was going to do something dreadful, she suddenly said in a quite different voice, My poor child, how cold you look. Come and sit with me. Edmund dared not to disobey, so he stepped onto the sledge, and the queen wrapped her warm fur mantle around him. Now what would you like to eat? She asked. Turkish delight, please, your majesty, said Edmund. The queen took out a small bottle and let one drop fall to the snow. Instantly there appeared a box of Turkish delight. Edmund had never tasted anything more delicious in his life. While he was eating, the queen asked him questions. She got him to tell her that he had a brother and 2 sisters, and that one of his sisters had already been in Narnia and met a faun. At last the Turkish delight was finished. Edmund wished he could have some more. He did not know that the Turkish delight was enchanted, and that anyone who had ever tasted it would want more and more of it. The queen knew quite well what Edmund was thinking, but instead of offering him more, she said, Son of Adam, I should so much like to meet your brother and your 2 sisters. Will you bring them here to see me? Because if you come again, you could eat Turkish delight all day long. I have no children of my own, and as you are the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met, I think I'd like to make you the Prince of Narnia. Then she pointed her wand. You only have to look for those 2 hills rising above the trees, and then walk toward them to reach my house. But remember, you must bring the others. I'll do my best, agreed Edmund. You needn't tell them about me, said the queen. It would be fun to keep it a secret between us 2. Make it a surprise for them. As the sledge swept away, she called, Don't forget, come soon. Edmund was still staring after it when she heard Lucy calling for him. Oh, Edmund, you got in too, she cried. I've been having lunch with dear Mr. Tumnus, and the White Witch has done nothing to him. So he thinks she can't have found out. The White Witch, said Edmund. Who's she? She's a perfectly terrible person, said Lucy. She calls herself the Queen of Narnia, though all of the fauns and nymphs and animals hate her. She can turn people into stone, and she's put an enchantment on Narnia, so that it's always winter. When he heard that the lady he had made friends with was a dangerous witch, Edmund felt very uncomfortable. But he still wanted to taste that Turkish delight more than anything else. So this time, they walked a good way. Then suddenly, they felt cords around them instead of branches. And the next moment, they were both standing outside the wardrobe in the empty room. Come on, said Lucy, let's find the others. There's a lot to tell them. But when Lucy told Peter and Susan that Edmund had been in Narnia too, he suddenly decided to do a very spiteful thing and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing pretending that a story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Now sightseers often came to see the professor's interest in Old House. The children usually kept out of the way, but one morning, a few days later, they just couldn't seem to avoid them. "Here, let's hide in the wardrobe room," said Susan. But once inside, they heard voices at the door. "Quick," said Peter, and flung open the wardrobe. They all bundled inside and suddenly found themselves surrounded by snow-covered trees. "Why, we've come into Lucy's woods," said Peter. He turned at her at once and said, "I'm so sorry for not believing you, Lou." "It's all right," said Lucy. "Let's go and see Mr. Tumnus. He's the nice fawn I've told you about." So each borrowing a fur coat, they set off. But at the Fern's Cave a terrible surprise awaited them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and everything lay smashed on the floor. Nailed to the carpet was a note. It said that Mr. Tumnus had been arrested for high treason against the Queen of Narnia. "She isn't a real queen at all," cried Lucy. "She's a horrible witch, and the wood people hate her. Oh, we must go and rescue Mr. Tumnus." "Look," cried Susan suddenly. "There's something amongst the trees." The whiskered furry face of a beaver peeked out at them. "Are you the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve?" it whispered, to show it was a friend. The beaver took out the handkerchief. Lucy had given that to Mr. Tumnus. "Poor fellow, he said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here," the beaver told them. Then it added, "Aslan is on the move." Now none of the children knew who Aslan was, but at his name each of them felt something jump inside. Peter felt brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if beautiful music just floated by. And Lucy got the feeling that you have at the beginning of summer. But Edmund felt only mysterious horror. "What about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh, not here," said the beaver. "I must bring you where we can have a real talk." So they hurried along behind their new friend and presently came to a large frozen river. A dam had been built across it, and on the top of the dam was a little house. Now Edmund also noticed two small hills in the distance, but once he was sure the White Witch's palace lay between them. Mrs. Beaver was waiting for them, and in no time the children were seated around a table eating freshly caught fish, boiled potatoes, and plenty of butter. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, when they'd all finished eating, "we can get to business. First of all, Mr. Tumnus has been taken to the Queen's house and turned into stone. There's nothing any of us could do on our own. But now that Aslan is on the move—" "Oh yes, tell us about Aslan," they all cried. "Aslan? Well, he's the king," said the beaver. "He's the great lion and lord of the whole wood. But not often here, you understand. Now word has reached us that he's come back to Narnia, and you are to meet him tomorrow at the stone table. He'll settle the White Witch all right, but there's an old saying that when Aslan returns and the two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve sit in the four thrones of their care Paravel. Then up at the end of not only the White Witch's eternal winter, but of her life. That's why she wants to get you to alter her castle, where she can turn you all into stone and rule Narnia forever. There was a moment's silence after Miss Beaver's last remark, and then suddenly Lucy said, "Where's Edmund?" Everyone rushed to the door and looked out. Snow was falling thickly and steadily, but Edmund was nowhere to be seen. "He'll have gone to the White Witch," said Mr. Beaver grimly. "I thought as if he looked as if he were under her enchantment. We must go to the stone table at once before the witch catches us. There's not one moment to lose." Edmund was indeed making his way to the White Witch's house. After a long and bitterly cold walk through snowy, icy drifts, he came to it at last. The iron gate stood wide open. He made his way cautiously through a courtyard filled with stone statues. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It rose, the hair bristling along its back, and growled, "Who's there?" "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling, "I'm the boy that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day." The wolf vanished into the house, and Edmund followed. "How dare you come alone?" cried the witch in a terrible voice. "I brought the others quite close, Your Majesty," stuttered Edmund. "They're with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A cruel smile came over the witch's face until Edmund told her all he'd heard before leaving the Beaver's house. "What, Aslan?" cried the Queen, and clapped her hands. Instantly the dwarf appeared. "Make ready our sledge," she ordered. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver were leading the children along the river bank. At last, when Lucy was so tired she was almost asleep on her feet, they came to a snug little hole where they could spend the night. They awoke to the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was the first out of a cave, like a flash, and they heard him shout, "It's all right. Come out, everyone. It isn't her." They all scrambled up the steep bank. There on his sledge sat Father Christmas, big and glad. "I've come at last," he said. "The White Witch has kept me out for a long time, but her magic is weakening. Aslan is on the move, and now for your presents," he smiled. "Mrs. Beaver, a new sewing machine is waiting for you at home, and Mr. Beaver, you will find your new dam quite finished." The kind creatures were so pleased they could hardly speak. Then Father Christmas gave Peter a magnificent sword and shield. For Susan there was a bow and a quiver of arrows, and a little horn. And last of all, he gave Lucy a clear crystal bottle and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of fire flowers. If you or any of your friends has hurt, a few drops of this will restore them." And then he cried out, "Merry Christmas, long live the true king," and drove out of sight. "It's time that we were moving on," said Mr. Beaver. Edmund, meanwhile, was having a terrible time. When he asked the witch for Turkish delight, she merely said, "Silence, fool." As they sped along the darkness, he felt colder and more miserable than he'd ever felt in his whole life. It didn't look now as if she intended to make him a king, and he longed to be with the others. At last morning came, and they were travelling along in daylight. Suddenly the witch stopped her sledge. Nearby sat a merry party, celebrating the return of Father Christmas. In fury the witch turned them all to stone, and Edmund, for the first time, felt sorry for somebody beside himself. As they raced on, Edmund noticed he was feeling much less cold, and soon patches of green started to show through the snow. The sledge gradually came to a halt, and the witch ordered them to leave it behind and walk. Then Edmund heard birds singing. His heart leapt, for he realised that the witch's cruel winter was over. Miles away, the other children were walking into what seemed a delicious dream, through warm sunlight, to green thickets and mossy glades. "Not long now," said Mr. Beaver, and began leading them up a hill. At the top stood the stone table, and nearly all sorts of wonderful creatures were gathered around Aslan himself. Centaurs, unicorns, wood nymphs, water sprites, deer, and great birds. The children could hardly look into the lion's royal, solemn eyes, for he was both good and terrible at the same time. Finally, Peter stepped forward and said, "We have come, Aslan." "Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Lucy and Susan, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he-beaver and she-beaver." His voice was rich and deep. "But where is the fourth?" "He has betrayed them and joined the White Witch," said Mr. Beaver. "Please, Aslan, can anything be done to save Edmund?" said Lucy. "All shall be done," said Aslan. And then he said to Peter, "Come, son of Adam, and I will show you the castle of Cair Paravel. For you are the firstborn, and you will be High King of Narnia over the rest." Below them, the evening light, when Narnia met the sea, the castle shone like a great star. Then suddenly, a noise broke the silence. "It is your sister's horn," said Aslan. Running toward the sound, Peter saw creatures scattering in every direction. Then he saw Susan swing herself up a tree, followed by a grey, huge wolf, snapping and snarling at her feet. Peter did not feel very brave, and he rushed straight up to the wolf and aimed a slash of his sword at his side. Quick as lightning, it turned on him, and a short, hard fight, Peter managed to plunge the sword into its heart. A moment later, the wolf lay dead. "Quick," shouted Aslan, "Senators, eagles, I see another wolf. He'll be going to his mistress. Now is the chance to find the witch and rescue the fourth son of Adam." Instantly, a dozen of the swiftest creatures disappeared in the gathering darkness. Peter shakenly wiped his sword clean on the grass. "Hand it to me and kneel, son of Adam," said Aslan. Then Aslan struck him with the flat of the blade and said, "Rise up, Sir Peter, wolf's bane." After Edmund had been made to walk further than he thought possible, the witch at last halted in a dark, that moment, a wolf rushed up to them, snarling. "They're at the stone table. They've killed my captain. Fly, fly." "No," said the witch. "Summon all our people. Call out the giants, the ghouls, the ogres, and the werewolves. We will fight." Edmund found himself forced to his feet by the dwarf and roughly tied to a tree. The witch muttered, "4 thrones in Cair Paravel, and how would it be if only 3 were filled?" Edmund's heart heard the terrible sound of a knife being sharpened. Then suddenly there was a drumming of hooves and the beating of wings, and Edmund felt himself being untied. Strong arms were around him and kind voices said, "Steady now." "And who's got the witch? Do you mean she's escaped?" To their surprise, the witch had vanished. But just at that moment, Edmund fainted. Presently, all the creatures all set back to the stone table, carrying Edmund with them. When the other children woke up the next morning, they saw Aslan and Edmund walking together. No one knew what Aslan said to Edmund, but there was a conversation that he never forgot. As the others drew near, Edmund shook hands with each of them and said, "I'm sorry." And everyone said, "That's all right." Then a leopard came up to Aslan and told him there was a message from the enemy. On the hilltop came the witch's dwarf. "Queen of Narnia desires to come and speak with you," he announced. "Tell your mistress that I grant her safe conduct, but she must leave her wand behind her at that great oak," replied Aslan. A few minutes later, the white witch stood before Aslan. "You have a traitor there, Aslan," she said. Everyone knew she meant Edmund. "And the deep magic says that for every treachery, I have a right to a kill, otherwise Narnia will perish in fire and water." "It is very true," said Aslan solemnly. Then he and the witch walked away from the others and talked, the golden face next to the dead white one. It was a terrible time, this, for everyone, waiting and wondering. At last the witch left with a look of fierce joy on her face. As soon as she had gone, Aslan said, "We must move from here." So they all set off, and as they walked, Aslan outlined to Peter plans for the battle. That night they camped in a valley, but after everyone had gone to sleep, Susan and Lucy lay awake, talking in the darkness, for Aslan had seemed sad all evening. "Look," Susan suddenly said, and they saw the great lion walking away into the wood silently. They both got up and followed him. In a moonlight clearing, he turned to them. "Dear Aslan, wherever you are going, may we come with you?" the girls begged him. "Yes," he answered. "I'll be glad of your company tonight, if you will promise to stop when I tell you." Presently they found themselves going up the slope of a hill on which the stone table stood. At the edge of the trees, Aslan stopped and said, "Children, you must leave me. I must go on alone, and whatever happens, do not let yourselves be seen. Farewell." The girls cried bitterly, and clung to him for a moment. A great crowd of evil creatures were standing around the stone table, and in the middle of them was the witch herself.
"The fool has come," she cried. "Bind him fast."
Shouting and jeering, they tied the lion with tight cords. It took all their efforts to lift him onto the table. Susan and Lucy waited for Aslan to roar and spring at his enemies, but he didn't, and they realised with horror that he was sacrificing himself for Edmund. The witch raised her stone knife with a cruel laugh. As she struck, the girls couldn't bear to look and covered their eyes. For a few moments the girls were in danger, as with wild cries the vile creatures came sweeping off the hilltop and disappeared into the forest. Lucy and Susan crept out to the open hilltop, then knelt sobbing in the wet grass and kissed the dead Aslan's cold face. All night long they wept and watched over him. Then, as they watched the sun rise, they heard a great cackling, deafening noise behind them. The stone table was broken in two, and Aslan had gone.
"Oh, this is more magic," said Susan.
"Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. There, larger than ever, stood Aslan himself.
"Aren't you dead, dear Aslan?" said Lucy.
He stooped his golden head and licked her forehead, and both girls flung themselves upon him.
"You see," he told them, "there's a magic even older than the deep magic. It says that if an innocent victim is killed instead of a traitor, the table would crack and death start working backwards. Oh, children, I feel my strength coming back to me." And he roared. Then Aslan told Lucy and Susan to climb on his back, for they had a long way to go. They sped through orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls, and down into wild valleys. It was nearly midday when they found themselves at the witch's castle. Aslan made a flying leap over the castle wall, and Susan and Lucy tumbled gently off his back in the middle of a courtyard full of statues. Then Aslan bounded up to a stone lion and breathed on him. A streak of gold ran through his marble back as the colour spread. The lion shook his mane, and the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Everywhere he went, Aslan brought the statues back to life, and the whole place rang with shouts and laughter. Best of all was when Lucy found Mr. Tumnus. Then the giant Rumblebuffin knocked down the last of the castle wall, and everyone set off to battle to help Peter and the others. When they arrived, there were statues dotted all over the battlefield. The witch had clearly been using her wand. With a roar that shook all Narnia, Aslan flung himself upon her. Most of the enemy was killed in the first charge, but when the rest saw that the witch was dead, they either gave up or fled. Peter looked pale, much older. He told the girls how Edmund had fought his way through 3 augurs to the witch and smashed his sword down on her wand. But he had been badly hurt. Remembering her precious cordial, Lucy poured out a few drops into her brother's mouth. In moments he was healed, and there on the battlefield, Aslan made him a knight.
next day they all marched eastward to Cair Paravel. In the great hall, all hung with peacock's feathers, Aslan solemnly crowned the children and led them to 4 thrones amid shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" That night there was a great feast, but in the middle of it, Aslan quietly slipped away. When the kings and queens noticed he wasn't there, they said nothing about it, as Mr. Beaver had already warned them. "He'll be coming and going. He's wild, you know. He's not like a tame lion." And so, in the years past, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy reigned over Narnia well and were loved by all. Then one day, Mr. Tumnus brought them news of the white stag who could grant wishes. He'd been seen in the western woods, so the 2 kings and the 2 queens set out on a hunting party. As soon as they entered the thick wood, Queen Susan said, "How strange, I see a tree of iron." And they walked towards it, and they suddenly remembered it was a lamppost, and soon, to their surprise, they were making their way not through branches, but through courts. The next moment they all came tumbling out of the wardrobe and into an empty room. There were no longer kings and queens, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the very same hour of the very same day in which they'd gone into the wardrobe to hide. And when they went to explain to the professor why 4 of his coats out of his wardrobe were missing, he didn't tell them not to be silly, but believed the whole story. "You won't get to Narnia again through the wardrobe," he said, "but someday you will get back. Once a king or queen of Narnia, always a king or queen of Narnia." And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was just the beginning of the adventures of Narnia.